I am Captain Ethan Hayes, 35 years old, serving in the U.S. Army Signal Corps for more than 12 years. And I wish I could tell you that the story starts with something heroic. It actually starts at a dinner table crowded with people who barely remembered I existed. I had spent the whole day slow cooking a rack of BBQ ribs, the kind that needed patience and steady heat, the kind that usually got at least a nod of appreciation. That night, they disappeared from the serving tray without a single person asking who made them, and I felt myself fade into the background the way I often did around the Doyle family. Colonel Raymond Doyle sat at the head of the table with the posture of a man who believed the room revolved around him. His voice carried across the plates and the murmurs as he praised his son, Lieutenant Adam Doyle, for a minor systems update that any junior tech could have handled. The praise sounded almost ceremonial, the kind meant to remind everyone of the Doyle name. I sat there listening to it all, knowing that 2 nights earlier I had kept an entire regional network from collapsing in the middle of an operation. I knew exactly what the failure would have cost, and the number was nothing small. No one at that table brought it up. No one even looked in my direction when the subject of recent wins was mentioned. I tried to focus on my food, hoping it would help me blend into the chair. Claire sat beside me, but she felt miles away. She nodded at her father and smiled at the right moments, but she avoided my eyes every time I shifted. We used to share little glances during these dinners, quiet links that helped us survive the weight of her family's expectations. Now she stayed locked behind a wall I could not reach, and the silence between us grew heavier each time the colonel lifted Adam up for achievements he barely understood. Across the table, Sergeant Olivia Brooks watched me with a strange intensity. She had joined our team a few months earlier, and I had assumed she was ambitious in a healthy way. Now her eyes felt sharper, almost analytical, like she was filing away pieces of me. She asked me questions late at night during shifts, questions that felt harmless then but now made sense in a way that chilled me. She had paid close attention to my systems, my process, my access points, and I had taken it as dedication. Looking at her that night, I realized she might have been studying me for reasons that had nothing to do with growth. I kept replaying the network recovery in my head. I had hovered over dead screens for 48 hours straight, rewiring broken pathways, fighting off a catastrophic chain reaction that should have taken weeks to untangle. No one else had touched that mess. I had carried it alone, and I had carried the burden of making sure no one above me took the hit. It was a soldier's job, a technician's pride, a quiet victory that saved the colonel from a fallout he never even realized he had avoided. The ribs were gone. The compliments floated around the room, moving from Adam to someone else, never landing in my direction. Claire reached for her glass without looking at me. The colonel raised his voice again, filling the room with certainty. Olivia kept watching. I felt myself shrinking into my seat, tired in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. By the time the plates were cleared, I knew something was shifting around me, something I could not name yet. I felt invisible in a house full of uniforms and medals, as if the years I had given meant nothing unless they carried the Doyle name. I swallowed the frustration and kept my shoulders straight, but inside I already sensed that this was only the beginning of a storm I could not avoid. I started noticing the small things first, the kind you only catch when you have spent years reading people out of necessity. Olivia began asking for access to tools she did not need, claiming she wanted to understand the deeper architecture of our systems. At first I took it as ambition, the kind that pushes a young sergeant to rise faster than expected. The longer it continued, the more her questions felt like a checklist, as if she was collecting pieces of a puzzle I did not know she was building. She watched the way I handled outages, watched the way I escalated threats, watched every decision I made with a focus that felt less like respect and more like calculation. She had a habit of smiling after I showed her something, but the smile never reached her eyes. It stayed fixed and thin, the way someone smiles when they get exactly what they wanted. She asked for temporary access once, then twice, then a third time with a reason that made no sense. I felt something tighten in my stomach each time she leaned over my desk, pretending to admire a line of code. I had trained dozens of soldiers in my 12 years of service, and none of them had ever made me feel like I was being mapped. At home, I tried to bring it up to Claire, hoping she would hear the worry in my voice. She listened, but not really. She nodded while scrolling through messages from her family, her face lit by the screen instead of by understanding. She told me I was reading too much into things. She told me Olivia was just trying to learn. She told me her father trusted Olivia already. The words landed with a cold weight that felt heavier than the conversation deserved. I wanted her to look at me the way she used to, but she kept her distance, and every time I tried to bridge the space between us, it grew wider. The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. There were moments during shifts when I caught Olivia glancing at my credentials, quick looks she tried to hide behind casual questions. There were late nights when she asked me to walk her through incident responses that no sergeant would ever handle alone. There were times when she appeared behind me without a sound, standing close enough to read my screens. I knew enough about human behavior to recognize intent, even when it was buried under politeness. Something was shifting around me, and I could feel it like pressure in the air before a storm. Nothing was wrong on paper, but everything felt off. My instincts had kept me alive more times than I could count, and they were warning me now in a way I could not ignore. I tried to tell myself it was stress, that the long hours and the mess with Claire were clouding my judgment. Deep down, I knew better. I could not explain it yet, but I was sure I was being moved into a position I did not choose, one step at a time, by someone who already understood what the final move would look like. It happened just after midnight, the kind of hour when the world feels thinner and every sound cuts sharper. I had been staring at my laptop for too long, trying to finish a report that should have taken an hour but dragged on because my mind kept circling back to Olivia's strange behavior. When the notification popped up, I almost ignored it. Most late emails were automated updates or system alerts, nothing urgent. Something made me click it anyway, maybe habit or maybe the quiet sense that my night was about to change. The subject line froze me before I even opened the message. It referenced the Norcom security recovery, the same operation I had held together through exhaustion and instinct. I clicked the email, and the words blurred for a second before settling into place. Olivia had written a clean, confident summary of the recovery, presented as if every decision and every sleepless hour had come from her. She talked about difficult choices she had made, the network paths she had restored, the vendors she had coordinated, and the protocols she had executed. She said she had already briefed Colonel Doyle and Adam earlier that day. My name did not appear once. A cold weight spread through my chest as I read each line. I had lived inside that recovery for 2 days, fighting off a cascading failure that could have crippled the region. I had taken responsibility for every detail, and now someone who had barely touched the project had claimed it as her own. I read her words again, slower this time, trying to find a trace of misunderstanding. There was none. Every sentence was designed to remove me from the narrative and replace me with her. It was clean, calculated, and confident. I opened the access logs next, something I had done hundreds of times in my career, but never with a sense of fear. The entries were clear. She had used temporary admin permissions on the exact days I had been buried in the recovery. She had pulled my notes, copied my proposals, and mirrored my backup plans. I scrolled through the timestamps until the truth stared back at me in a long row of unauthorized access dressed up as routine checks. Each log entry felt like a punch, and I felt my heartbeat rise as the pattern formed in front of me. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. It felt like the room tilted a little, like the air had been knocked out of me. Betrayal was not new in the military, but I had never felt it aimed at me with this kind of precision. I had wanted to believe I was imagining her intentions, that I was tired or paranoid. Now I could see what she had been building piece by piece, using every question and every smile to pry open a door I never should have left unlocked. My hand moved before I fully processed what I was doing. I forwarded the email to my personal account, attaching the access logs and a few notes to myself. I added nothing more, no explanation, no anger, no accusation. I just wanted the truth to exist somewhere no one else could reach. When I hit send, a sharp chill settled over me, the kind you feel before something breaks. I knew I should have tried to sleep, but my body refused to shut down. I lay on my back in the dark hours afterward, staring at the faint glow of the clock. Thoughts came in jagged waves as I replayed every moment of the last few weeks. The patterns were clearer now: Olivia's attention, Claire's distance, the way Colonel Doyle praised Adam with such rehearsed pride, the silence at the dinner table, the strange looks, the tension I had felt without a name. It all pointed in one direction, and none of it felt accidental. I could not shake the sense that I had just glimpsed the first part of a plan that had been unfolding around me without my awareness. I did not know what the next move would be or how deep it went, but I could feel something gathering in the dark, shaped by hands that had already decided where they wanted me to fall. I stayed awake until morning, listening to my own breathing and waiting for the rest of the trap to reveal itself. I walked into the strategy room expecting a routine briefing, the kind where everyone shuffled in half awake and waited for orders. Instead, I stopped cold just inside the doorway. Olivia was sitting in my chair at the head of the table with her back straight, her hands resting on a stack of printed files I recognized instantly. They were mine. My reports, my audits, my system designs, all laid out in front of her like trophies she had taken from a hunt. The room was already full. Colonel Doyle stood near the screens with his arms folded. Adam sat beside him with his eyes fixed on the floor. Two officers from military legal were seated along the wall, their faces stiff and unreadable. I felt something tighten in my chest as Olivia looked up at me. She did not even bother to look guilty. She gave a small nod, almost like she was welcoming me to a meeting I had not been invited to. I stepped forward, trying to understand why my files were spread out in front of her. Before I could speak, she began talking about system irregularities and access violations tied directly to my credentials. Her voice was smooth and confident in a way that made my skin crawl. She pointed to highlighted sections in my own reports as if they were evidence of negligence. I listened, frozen, as she described situations she had never handled, assigning blame to choices she had never made. Every word landed with a sharp sting. I looked at Adam, hoping he would at least meet my eyes. He kept staring at the table, his fingers tapped against his leg in a nervous rhythm. Doyle stood still with the stiff posture of a man who had decided the ending of a story before it even started. The legal officers watched me without any sense of curiosity, like they had already been briefed and were only waiting for the paperwork to catch up. I realized then that this was not a misunderstanding or a sudden crisis. It was deliberate and planned. It was a coordinated takedown built piece by piece while I had been too tired or too trusting to see it forming. Humiliation rose through me like heat, slow but choking. I stood there in a room full of people I had served with for years and felt myself being stripped of the respect I had earned. Olivia kept talking, outlining failures that were not mine. The colonel nodded along as if he had heard it all before. The walls felt closer with every passing second. I held my breath to keep my voice steady because the anger inside me was sharp enough to break through if I let it slip. By the time she finished, the room had closed in around me so tightly that even standing upright felt like a fight. I understood then that whatever happened next would not be about truth. It would be about power, and I had just seen who held it. Colonel Doyle stepped forward with a steady calm that felt rehearsed, the kind a man uses when he wants everyone to know he is in control. He announced that I was being suspended effective immediately and that I had 5 minutes to clear my belongings. The words settled over the room with a cold finality that made the silence feel heavier than the accusation itself. No one looked directly at me. A few officers shifted in their seats, their discomfort obvious, but none of them spoke. The legal staff watched with blank faces, already preparing to move on to whatever came next. I felt anger push up against my ribs, but I held it down and kept my posture straight. Pride was the only thing I still owned in that moment, and I was not going to let them take that from me too. I nodded once, a small gesture meant to show that I heard the order, not that I accepted the lie behind it. I walked out of the room and headed toward my office without waiting for anyone to escort me. My hands stayed steady as I pulled my few things into a box, the same box I had used during every transfer or deployment. Each item felt heavier than it should, not because of weight but because of what they represented. I had just placed the last folder inside when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned expecting an officer sent to hurry me along. Instead, I saw Sergeant Sean Martinez standing in the doorway with his arms crossed. He did not say anything. He just nodded, a quiet gesture of loyalty that hit me deeper than any words could have. He stepped into the room and picked up another box even though there was nothing left to pack. His presence alone said everything. Then Priya came. Then Marcus. Then Logan. One by one they filled the hallway until it was crowded with familiar faces, all from my unit, all watching me with steady eyes. 18 soldiers in total. They did not ask what had happened. They did not wait for permission. They simply turned and began walking out with me as if it had been decided long before this moment. Their boots echoed through the corridor in a slow, unified rhythm that felt louder than any order the colonel had ever given. We passed Colonel Doyle and the legal officers on our way out. The colonel's expression cracked for the first time. His confidence faltered as he watched an entire unit walk away, not out of rebellion but out of loyalty to the man he had just tried to bury. The legal team froze, taken off guard by the sight of soldiers leaving in formation without being told to. The air shifted around us, charged with a quiet power I had not felt in years. When we stepped outside into the open air, I felt something lift from my chest. I had been stripped of my title and my place, but I was not alone. Those 18 soldiers made sure the world would remember that piece of truth. It was the kind of moment that would spread through the base within an hour and across the military within a day, not because of the drama but because loyalty like that did not happen by accident. It was earned, and no suspension order could erase it. The box felt heavier than it should have as I carried it through the front door, even though it held only a few items from my office. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint tapping of Claire's fingers on her keyboard. She sat at the kitchen counter with her laptop open to one of her father's reports, her eyes fixed on numbers and charts that suddenly mattered more to her than the man standing in the doorway. She glanced up just long enough to register the box in my hands, then looked back at the screen as if she already knew what story she wanted to believe. She told me her father had called. She said he told her I had lost control and caused a scene in front of senior staff. The words came out flat, practiced, as if she had repeated them to herself before I arrived. I stood there for a moment, feeling the sting settle deeper than any order Doyle had given me. I wanted her to look up again, to search my face the way she used to when she cared about the truth. She kept her eyes on the screen as if the safest place in the room was anywhere I was not. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I opened the email I had forwarded the night before and held it out to her without saying a word. She hesitated before taking it. When she finally read the message, her face drained of color. She scrolled through every line, then went back and read them again. Her hand shook just enough for me to notice. She looked at me, then at the floor, caught between loyalty to her family and the truth staring back at her. She did not defend Olivia. She did not defend her father. She just stood there trapped in the silence she had helped build. When she finally spoke, her voice was thin and tired. She said she needed space. She grabbed her coat without looking at me and walked toward the door with a kind of urgency that felt like she was escaping rather than leaving. She stepped outside and closed the door gently, which somehow hurt more than if she had slammed it. I stood alone in the kitchen with the box still in my hands, surrounded by the faint echo of a life that no longer felt like mine. The house was quiet, but not peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that settles into the walls when trust has already died. I set the box down on the counter and realized that everything I had built was slipping away, piece by piece, and there was no one left in that house willing to hold on with me. The call came the next evening while I was sitting alone in the living room, surrounded by a silence that felt heavier than the uniform folded on the chair beside me. I almost ignored the unknown number, but something made me answer. The voice on the other end was calm and low, identifying herself as a military legal officer who wanted to speak off the record. She told me the disciplinary action taken against me was improper. She said the process had been rushed, the documentation incomplete, and the accusations inconsistent with my service record. Her tone carried the kind of careful urgency that made every word feel like a lifeline. She told me something else that made my stomach tighten. Colonel Doyle had a pattern, a long trail of quiet interventions meant to protect Adam whenever he made mistakes, shifting blame onto those who could not push back. She said my case looked like another attempt to shield Adam and uplift Olivia, who had become a convenient bridge between the two. Hearing it out loud filled the room with a sharp clarity I had not felt in weeks. It was not paranoia. It was not exhaustion. It was a pattern, and I had finally become its target. After we hung up, I sat still for a long moment, letting the truth settle. Then I stood and went to my desk with a steadiness that surprised me. I opened my laptop and began pulling every log tied to the Norcom recovery, tracing each action back to its source. I cross-checked backups, flagged timestamps, and documented every unauthorized access Olivia had used to gather my files. Hours passed without me noticing. The work came easily, almost calming, like I had finally stepped back onto ground that belonged to me. The next day, I reached out to the 18 soldiers who had walked out with me. They did not hesitate. They sent statements describing the work I had done, the hours they had witnessed, and the way Olivia had hovered around the project without contributing. Their words were steady and clear, written with the kind of loyalty that could not be faked. With each message, I felt something repair itself inside me. I was not alone. I had never truly been alone. By the end of the week, I had a stack of evidence that was stronger than anything Doyle could fabricate. The fear that had followed me since the moment I read Olivia's email began to loosen its grip. In its place grew a slow, determined resolve. I was tired of being pushed into corners built by other people's ambition. I was tired of letting silence shape the truth. For the first time since everything collapsed, I felt a sense of direction, not anger, not desperation, something steadier, something almost like purpose. The pieces of my life were still scattered, but now I had enough strength to start picking them up and fitting them together in a way that made sense. Whatever came next, I was not walking into it broken. I was walking into it ready. The collapse started faster than anyone expected. Olivia had been given access to a regional communications system she barely understood, a responsibility she had only because Doyle wanted to elevate her. She pushed a faulty update through without checking dependencies, then tried to force a manual override when the system locked. Within minutes, the entire network spiraled into failure, cutting off critical channels and triggering emergency protocols meant for far more serious events. The damage cost millions and left commanders scrambling to stabilize what she had dismantled in seconds. News of the meltdown reached Doyle before the system had even finished crashing. He erupted in a rage loud enough to carry through the halls, shouting as if volume alone could repair what incompetence had destroyed. Adam tried to help, fumbling with commands he barely recognized while sweat gathered at his temples. Their panic spread through the room like a thick fog. The officers who once nodded along with every Doyle decision now exchanged wary looks. No one rushed to defend Olivia. No one pretended this was anything other than a disaster created by the same people who had tried to lay their failures on me. Higher command launched a full investigation by the next morning. They traced every step, every login, every unauthorized action. My name never appeared. Olivia's appeared everywhere. Adams showed a trail of corrections made too late to matter. Doyle's oversight record collapsed under scrutiny, revealing a pattern of rushed approvals, cover-ups, and misplaced trust in people who could not perform under pressure. Military news outlets picked up the story almost immediately. Reporters used phrases like leadership crisis and internal mismanagement. The Doyle name, once spoken with automatic respect, now appeared beside headlines questioning judgment and accountability. I watched it unfold with a quiet sense of justice, not anger, just the simple truth rising to the surface. The empire they had built on ego and shortcuts was cracking from within, and no amount of authority could hold it together. We had nothing but conviction when we started Sentinel Ridge Systems, and for a while that was all we could afford. We found a small warehouse on the edge of town that smelled like dust and old paint, but it had enough outlets to power our servers and enough space for the 18 soldiers who refused to leave my side. We dragged in folding tables, stacked mismatched chairs, and set up equipment that looked more like a scavenged mission kit than the foundation of a company. It did not matter. For the first time in months I felt free, and I could see the same feeling reflected in the faces around me. They were not following a rank anymore, they were following a purpose. The early days were brutal. We stayed up through nights patching hardware we could not afford to replace. We coded until our hands cramped, tested systems until our eyes blurred, and mapped out business plans on whiteboards that were already stained from previous tenants. Money was tight, and every decision carried the weight of survival. Yet no one complained. The same teamwork that had kept us alive in uniform carried over into this new life. We moved like a unit, thinking ahead for each other, stepping in without being asked, trusting instincts that had been shaped under pressure. Our first break came from an old contact who remembered what we had done long before the accusations. He handed us a small contract to stabilize a local network, something barely big enough to keep our lights on. We treated it like a mission, delivered results faster than expected, and sent a report that read like a promise. That contract led to another, then another. The momentum grew slowly at first, but when the first major client reached out, everything changed. It was a communications firm looking for a secure overhaul, the kind of project usually reserved for established defense contractors. They had seen the investigation reports. They had seen what happened to Doyle's command. More importantly, they had seen the article calling us the 5-Minute Rebellion Unit, a nickname born from the moment my team walked out with me. It caught on fast, spreading through forums and military circles, turning our story into something larger than any of us expected. Signing that major contract felt like crossing a threshold. The team gathered around the old conference table when the confirmation email arrived. No one spoke at first. We just looked at each other with the kind of pride that came from building something with bare hands and unbroken loyalty. I felt a swell of gratitude that hit harder than any promotion ever had. We expanded the office, upgraded our systems, and brought in partners who trusted results instead of reputations. Work poured in from agencies, private companies, and individuals who wanted security built by people who had seen what failure could cost. Sentinel Ridge Systems grew faster than I had imagined. It became a place where skill mattered more than names and where every success was shared by the whole unit. Standing in that warehouse turned headquarters, watching the team move with confidence and purpose, I realized I had rebuilt my life without even noticing the exact moment it started. I was no longer defined by the shadow of Doyle's name or the weight of someone else's agenda. I had stepped into something new, something earned, something ours. I had lost almost everything, but in the loss I found a future stronger than anything I had left behind. Claire showed up on a quiet afternoon when most of the team was out meeting a client. I was in my office reviewing a new systems map when I saw her standing in the doorway holding a thick envelope. She looked smaller than I remembered, like life had been pressing down on her in ways she could no longer hide. Her eyes were tired, not from anger but from carrying truths she had avoided for too long. She stepped inside without speaking and set the envelope on my desk with a gentle care that made the moment feel heavier. She told me she had been in therapy for months trying to understand why she stood silent while her family tore my career apart. She said she finally saw the control, the manipulation, and the way loyalty in her house was measured by obedience instead of truth. There was no defensiveness in her voice. She was not trying to fix anything. She was only trying to be honest, even if the honesty came too late. She said she knew the marriage had already unraveled long before the suspension and that handing me the divorce papers was the last step she had avoided. I nodded, not out of coldness but because there was nothing left to argue with. Some endings arrive quietly, and this one had been waiting for us for a long time. We talked for a while, not about blame, but about the years before everything changed. There were no raised voices, no accusations, only the soft ache of two people acknowledging that pieces of themselves had shifted in different directions. When she stood to leave, I walked her to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame and said she hoped I found something better than what she could give. I believed her. I wished her peace. Then she left the same way she came, quietly and without drama. News of her father's demotion reached me the following week. Doyle had been reassigned to a remote post far from the influence he once relied on. The old command had finally seen through the structure he built, and the weight of his choices had settled where it belonged. I expected to feel triumphant, but the feeling never came. What I felt instead was clarity. Standing in the office we had built from nothing, surrounded by the hum of servers and the quiet strength of the team outside my door, I realized that losing the life I thought I needed had given me something far greater. Being cut loose had not broken me. It had freed me. I learned more from losing everything than I ever did from holding a title. Betrayal hurts in a way that settles deep, but it also forces you to see who you are when the ground drops out from under you. What carried me through was not anger, but the slow decision to rebuild my life with people who chose loyalty through action instead of words. I want you to remember that being underestimated does not define your worth, and being pushed aside does not mean you stay there. Sometimes the fall is the start of the climb you were meant to make. If you have ever been dismissed, mistreated, or counted out, I hope you found a way to rise anyway. I would like to hear your story. Have you faced a moment when someone tried to break you, and what helped you stand back up again?